Kwai, Uluku, Tansi, hello, bonjour. I'm Carolyn Bennett, and I'm joining you today from my home in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, where we honor all of the Indigenous peoples who paddled these waters and whose moccasins walked these lands. And we'd like to recognize the traditional territories from where all of you are joining us today. And so it's so great that we are welcoming Wah Bryce to speak to us about his best-selling and award-winning novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, Onabini Geezes. Is that right, Wah? That's how you say it in Anishinaabemowin?
Yeah, I'd say you nailed it there, Minister Bennett. Good job.
It just, I think some people write with words, and you've been able to write with pictures, which just is just such an amazing gift. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, miigwech, Minister. Very honored to be here today. I would just like to acknowledge the traditional territory of Tikimikshing Nishnabek. I currently reside in Sudbury, which is also known as Swakamuck. And this is the lands of the Robinson-Huron Treaty, signed in 1850, which predates Canadian Confederation. So again, Chmiigwech, thank you very much for having me.
This is so great. And obviously in rereading the book, Rob, it was quite something about how it's a parallel almost in a fictional form about the fear that happens when a catastrophe takes place. But I think a lot of people have feelings about the link with what so many people have felt this year with the pandemic. Have you had thoughts about that this year in terms of how prescient the book was and tapping into the fears of things really changing?
It was definitely strange as the pandemic unfolded to, I guess, see some of the parallels between what was unfolding in real life and the book. And I think the parallels are few. There aren't many direct lines from the current pandemic to the book itself, but there are moments that I think people can relate with, which is what I believe maybe intrigued and compelled people to the story or back to the story. But as a result of the pandemic happening, the book got a bit of a second wind because, it's been out for a few years now. So more people gravitated towards it, I think. At the beginning of the pandemic, like a year ago, we didn't know what was going to happen. There was no vaccine. There was no sort of clear plan out of this thing. So I think when people read like post-apocalyptic stories, they know that there's going to be some kind of resolution at the end. So maybe that's comforting. Maybe that's why people sort of gravitate towards a story like this. But yeah, it definitely has been interesting to live through a pandemic after writing a similar story.
As someone who grew up with parents that went through the Depression and then World War II, I was interested in your question really about whether the children will forget. Will the children take this throughout their lives? And certainly in the novel, it's pretty harsh reality that those children have lived through. What do you think about that? Do you think children will remember or forget, or do they jump to the better time that really is in the end of the book? What do you think happens to children? And congratulations on your new baby. And that very lucky older brother.
Yeah, it is really interesting to consider the experience of the children and the impression of these changing times on them. We just coincidentally, at this time, we are going through online school for our older son, who's in junior kindergarten at the moment, and he is not enjoying it at all. It is not a positive experience for him. So, yeah, to answer your question, it's an intergenerational learning process, really, surviving a crisis. And there are so many examples in my life where I reflect on those moments that have really opened my eyes to the truth of this land, of the country of Canada. And it's frustrating, it's angering to learn those truths, but at the same time it's inspiring, and to learn of how our people have survived that and have been resilient and have really maintained our culture and so on. So yeah, it's a familiar process, it's a communal process, and we're a long ways to getting to where we need to be, but I've seen improvements in my life, and I'm hopeful for my children's future. Absolutely.
In the examining resilience, the book, the older brother Evan had the skills and the sort of discipline and fortitude, but the knowledge of survival, of how to be comfortable on the land, and be proud of it. His younger brother Cam, not so much, and in some ways that contrast between the two brothers, I think, was very important, in that Evan still felt he had to look after Cam, in spite of his deficiencies, shall we say. But it is I think you are really demonstrating what needs to happen if people need to get back to their original skills and their secure personal cultural identity as being an Indigenous person that is competent on the land and the water. And I I just think that that theme is so important.
Mm. Oh, miigwech, yeah, and all of that is really, I guess, a recognition and an awareness of the bond we traditionally had with the land and how vital it is in sustaining our lives, and that relationship that we really need to nurture of coexistence, of living with the land, not just on it or uh, because of it, and not engaging in an exploitative relationship with it. And that is inherent, I think, in a lot of indigenous cultures, and it's what I learned growing up. I grew up in a home without hydro or running water when I was a child, and we didn't have those, I guess, modern luxuries until later on in my childhood, right? So I think that's where the root of that really comes from. And at the end of the day, and we have sort of gotten a glimpse of this through the pandemic, but the systems all around us aren't totally reliable. The infrastructure that we've become dependent on could eventually fall apart. And when all these systems fail us, which they very could well, what's going to be there? The land. The land is there for us. We have everything we need around us to survive, if we have the skills, right? And it's just, yeah, I really wanted to highlight that bond. And in many ways, the book is, a love letter to the land itself and an acknowledgement of our traditional relationship with it. And also, it's a bit of a motivator, for me. Of course, I grew up on the res, but I've lived in cities since I was 19. I moved down to Toronto to go to journalism school. And, I've been an urban Indigenous person since then, right? And I've sort of moved away from that lifestyle that I engaged with when I was a kid and in my youth, so I've been slowly trying to get back into that sort of mindset and into that way of life, and hopefully I'll get there eventually, but yeah, writing a book about the end of the world is a good motivator for sure.
Well, it is. And the character in your book, Eileen, the elder, that is very, very important to Evan. There's many things that she said that I found, really important teachings. But there, as you say with the land, at one point she says that people are going to have to learn how to gather their medicines because they might be needed when honestly, the pharmacy drops don't happen anymore. I mean, it's I just think that attachment to the land and someone who's a connector to the traditional ways of healing and keeping well and all of those things was so important. She also said, when asked about the apocalypse, she said that there was no word for that in your language, but she also said they'd already had what was being described when the Jaganosh, is that
Oh, Jaganash, yeah.
Oh, the white people who thought they knew better came and scooped up all their children and took them away. She said that was the apocalypse for their families, their communities. She did say the world ended at that time, and and I think we're all still watching that unfold in the harm that was done, then the abuse, the what people had to do to numb the pain. This has been a very, very difficult time. How are you feeling about, your children being able to grow up in a way that is resilient and with their self-esteem?
Well, I'm glad you brought up that passage with Eileen because that was really inspired by a conversation I had with my own grandmother when I was a teenager. And she passed a few years ago. Her name was Aileen Rice, and she was a well-regarded elder in our community of Wissahickon and very influential on my life. Really helped raise me to be a proud Anishinaabe person. When I was younger, during one of our chats, whenever I would visit her at her house on the res, we just started talking. She always really wanted to share Anishinaabe history with us kids, with her grandkids, specifically the history of our ancestors that now reside in Wissahickon. And she told me one day, you're really not that far removed from the end of the Anishinaabe world. That is just within your lineage, not too far back. And she said when she was younger, her grandparents in that generation would tell her about all the things that they had to survive. So where our people currently reside, on the shore of Georgian Bay on an island there, our ancestors traditionally traversed that since time immemorial. They've walked up and down the shoreline of Georgian Bay according to the season, according to the food, or whatever else, right? They were mobile according to season and so on. But after the Robinson-Huron Treaty was signed and then interpreted by what became Canada, the Department of Indian Affairs said, okay, you people, we think the treaty means you have to go out onto this island, which was called Perry Island, but we now call Wissahickon, right? And she said her grandparents told her about that time when they were displaced from the mainland, and the white people told them that they couldn't move around anymore. They had to stay on this island. So forestry became the primary industry in what's now Parry Sound, Ontario, right? Which was the traditional settlement, one of the traditional settlements for our ancestors. And she said that generation, her grandparents' generation, would sit on the shore of the island and look across at the mainland where Parry Sound is now and just see the trees being clear cut, just the land being raised, the land that had sustained them since forever. And it was devastating, obviously, totally devastating. So the Indian Act obviously came into law, and that forbade them from leaving this island without permission. It forbade them from engaging in their culture, forbade them from gathering in groups. There was an Indian agent who came in to enforce all those laws. And then the children started getting taken away to residential school and so on. So you had this succession of traumatic events created by Canada, the country itself, that ended the Anishinaabe world. And what's been left is people picking up the pieces to try to move on. So I was raised with that knowledge from my grandmother, not just to be aware of how close that end of the world is to me, but also what I need to do to move on and how I need to hang on to what we've been able to salvage in order to pass on to my children and the generations after, to ensure that this way of life survives despite everything that has happened to our people, you know? So that's what keeps me going, you know, this teaching I received from my grandmother, and then the teachings I've received from, you know, all my relatives and all my elders, and the teachings I've received from, you know, my Canadian relatives too, because of course I am of mixed Anishinaabe and Canadian descent. And I come from a very, you know, loving and aware family that's come together, you know, I guess in the spirit of reconciliation before that became a buzzword, right? You know, like, you know, I was born in the late 70s, and you know, I had this great background of these families coming together to raise us and my cousins with that awareness and all that. So yeah, not to go too far down that road, but that's what inspires me to keep my children going. And that's what's really, I guess, influences my decision making, how I carry myself through life, and how I try to, I guess, impress upon others the importance of knowing history and knowing culture, and being proud of what we have and how we can move forward. So there is obviously still a long way to go. Canada obviously has a huge responsibility to repair that damage, specifically with what's happened with our languages. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I've seen great leaps happen within my lifetime. So, you know, if at the grassroots we're able to maintain this knowledge and move forward in a good way, within our communities and with our neighbors as well, our non-Indigenous neighboring communities, hopefully we can get to that place.
Throughout the book, you are, you know, putting in, you know, words of your language, you know, teaching gently, I think, all that out. Tell me a little bit, Bob. I mean, did you go to journalism school because you were a good storyteller? How did you then take this career, this very successful career as a journalist, and decide that you wanted to focus on writing?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. You know, I really wasn't sure what kind of career I was going to have when I was in high school, just because it was not clear to me, you know. And being in high school in the 1990s in Ontario, I wasn't really aware of Indigenous authors or Indigenous journalists, right? Even though there were great people out there blazing trails for people like me and the people, my peers, and the people who will follow after us and so on, right? I was fortunate to be put on the path of journalism by, I guess, an elder who had a connection within journalism, who inspired me to take it up, because I ended up going on a student exchange program to Germany when I was 17. And I was asked to write monthly articles for the Nishnabek News about that experience. So that was my first exposure to journalism. And that's what really inspired me to apply to journalism school after that, right? And for me, what I gleaned from that was, you know, an opportunity to make connections between communities, but also, most importantly, to raise awareness of Indigenous issues, because it really wasn't happening that much back then. You know, my experience with media up until I pursued journalism was largely negative. Whenever I saw media was only when bad things were happening in our community or around us, right? And I never saw Indigenous people reflected in a positive light. So I never considered it at all. You know, I thought that was not a world for me. And, you know, I thought it was maybe even an antagonizing force against Indigenous people and our truths and our realities. But, you know, all the while I was really interested in creative writing. I loved English class in high school. I loved reading. I just found it very compelling to try to be creative using words. And as a hobby, I would write short stories in my bedroom after school, you know, on a pad of paper with a pen, you know, back on the res. So that's how that all started. And again, it was being fortunately connected with knowledgeable people who encouraged me to write more and to seek publication opportunities, you know. So they both sort of came hand in hand. journalism, I guess, became a clear path for me because I went to journalism school and I graduated and made some good connections, and ultimately started working right away. But all the while, I had these fiction dreams that I didn't want to give up on, and they eventually turned into good opportunities. And Moon of the Crescent Snow ended up being, I guess, my ticket out of journalism ultimately.
Yeah.
And I just give thanks to everybody who's read it, including you, and for giving me this opportunity to keep talking about it. So, I had a great career at CBC. Of course, there were some issues here and there along the way, but I loved my time there. But I'm just excited to focus solely on fiction writing at this point. So I feel
So,
very, very fortunate and very thankful for all the opportunities I've had.
well, it feels in some ways exploring your culture and being able to teach through your novel. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on now. I know you can't tell us too much, but if you would tell us a little bit of a appetizer.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to pick up on one thing you just said there about sharing culture. With fiction, even though it's not real or it's not the truth, I think it's a really cool opportunity to do a deep dive into some cultural things, and to share some cultural elements that I didn't necessarily have the opportunity to in journalism. So there's a way to sort of contextualize things in fiction that you don't really get the opportunity to do in journalism. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, because I do appreciate that. I guess a trait of fiction and being able to do that. So yeah, I'm working on part 2 of Moon of the Crested Snow. It is tentatively called Moon of the Turning Leaves at this point. Hopefully it will be out in late 2022. I just submitted the first draft to my editor this month. So we will begin the revision process, and hopefully everything will stick to schedule. But basically what part 2 is 10 years after the end of Moon of the Crested Snow, and the community decides that they want to venture south and return to their original homelands, because you'll remember in Moon of the Crested Snow, they discuss being displaced from the Georgian Bay area to far northern Ontario. So in Moon of the Turning Leaves, they decide they want to go back, mostly to explore what's left after the end of the world, but to see if it's viable to return home. And part of that is, they've sort of maybe overstayed their welcome in their region a bit. Natural resources is starting to dwindle where they currently reside. So yeah, it's a quest story that goes over the span of a couple of months, and yeah, hopefully you'll all be interested in it.
Thank you so much. And I think, Bob, just you're an inspiration to all of the boys and girls who now know they can go home after school or after sitting in front of their screen and write a short story. So this is so exciting, and we look forward to the next one and the next one and the next one. And we just thank you so much for all that you're doing. And as you say, what we now call reconciliation, but it really is about learning and humbly learning as the non-Indigenous people in Canada to understand what we never learned in school, as you said, but we can learn more by picking up a book from a First Nations, Inuit, or Métis author, and really immerse ourselves in the importance of language and culture and the history that still remains a mystery to too many people. So thank you, Miigwech, Chi-miigwech, 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 Chi-miigwech.
With Chi-miigwech, Minister Bennett, it has been an honor to share with everybody today. Really appreciate being a part of this initiative. I encourage all viewers to go out and read books by Indigenous authors, and yeah, just enjoy yourself. So Chi-miigwech.